Good evening and welcome to this presentation of Central Ohio Nature. This particular program is Agriculture and Nature Part 2. So we will pick up where we left off from Part 1. So what we will cover is the denizens of the ditches, which we spoke about the ditches in our last program as one of the agricultural habitats for wildlife. We will talk about crop field preparation and what that means for wildlife. And then we will take a kind of a deep dive look at Lake Erie versus the intensive animal farming industry and the effects of that. So one of the habitats we talked about last time was wet ditches. And these are just what the term says. They are ditches that are filled with water most of the time. And they have been made by farmers, their sole purpose being to drain excess water away from farm fields and into streams, or in some cases into storm sewer systems. Now, why does this matter? Many municipalities do not mow wet ditches in April through May. Why is that significant? Well, that is prime nesting and fledging season for a number of species of birds who like to nest in the tall grasses of the wet ditches. Now, before this was in place with a lot of municipalities, the Department of Transportation and county agencies, red-winged blackbirds and rusty blackbirds, who are the prime inhabitants of this real estate during nesting and fledging season, saw in the last 30 years a 93% population decrease, which was attributed directly to the fact that these areas were being mown, and the octopus mowers and so on that were coming through and doing that mowing were destroying the nests and the eggs, in some cases killing fledglings that were in the nests. Oops, did it again. We will go back here. So we have that to deal with, and most areas are doing pretty well with it. Now, to change track a little bit, to plow or not to plow, that is the question. William Shakespeare might have asked that on this topic. And we have a few different ways that farmers can deal with the plowing of their fields, and each affects wildlife in different ways. On the left-hand side here, on that side of the coin, we have, first of all, no-till plowing and ridge-till plowing. That versus, on the other side of the coin, traditional, or what is called mulch-till plowing, which is done 3 times a year. No-till plowing is where the farmers seed their land without plowing under what was there in terms of crop waste and so on from the previous year. Now, what that does is it reduces soil runoff and erosion. However, it also reduces surface arthropods, in other words, insects, bugs, grubs. Without the plowing and disking to bring those things up to the surface, they are not there as readily available for wildlife. And we're talking about birds, we're talking about possums and skunks who eat grubs and certain other insects. The next one, which is somewhat similar, is ridge till. And that is where long rows of humps are established for seeds. That reduces runoff and erosion as well. It's especially used in hilly areas, but again, reduces surface arthropods for wildlife. Now, the third option is the traditional or mulch till. And with that, as everybody's probably seen at one time or another, soil is tilled deeply with plows and disking up to 3 times a year. That brings a lot of arthropods to the surface. It also mulches the soil internally with the previous year's crop residue, and it helps regulate heat in the soil for as far down as the plowshares and the discs reach. However, there is greater risk of erosion and runoff, and we will talk about that a little bit here. So let's investigate. Now, on this photo on the left, as you can see, this is a gigantic field, all planted with the same crop. And there are no tree or fence lines. So if traditional plowing is done, there is a much greater chance of soil erosion by wind. And as we discussed in our last program, if all of a farmer's topsoil blows away, the land becomes useless for planting. So why have this big chunk of land if you can't plant on it? Now, in the 2 photos on the right, as you can see, these are both hilly fields, and hilly fields are prone to erosion, mainly by water runoff. So in this case, they would really want to do no plow seeding. And again, this is not going to bring the arthropods to the surface for our wildlife, but it's going to help that soil stay in place. Now, a few other examples here. Photo number 1 on the left. They can easily, at this farm, do the traditional plowing, because in the background there, you can see a pretty thick tree line. And in the foreground, you can see there's a stone wall and a fence, and then a fence row with tall grasses. So that acts as a windbreak, all of that, to keep soil from blowing away. In photo 2, similar situation. Now this field looks like it has a hill to it, or at least a slope anyway. But they could do traditional plowing here because you have this fence row with the tall grasses growing on either side of it. In photo 3, this cornfield, they can do traditional plowing here as well, because you see in the background, there is a nice row of pines there that are fairly tall, fairly close together. And behind them is a taller row of poplars that are even closer together. And then in photo 4, we see a farmer on a small field, or maybe this is a section of an L-shaped field, we don't really know, that is actually doing traditional plowing. And as you can see in front of him there is a very thick tree line. In fact, it may even be a wood lot. On the right, it looks like there is a unfarmed hill that also has a pretty thick tree line on it. So he's safe to be doing what he's doing. There's not much chance for soil erosion there. And a couple of other examples. Now, these are all about the ridge till farming. And in photo number 1, you see where this has been done. It's most easily seen in the foreground. You can see the ridges or rows, and they are all going cross hill. So that is going to prevent or help prevent rain from washing the topsoil down into those little winding valleys that you see throughout the landscape there. Number 2, this is a farmer who is in the process of converting a field to ridge till. And he's got a piece of equipment there on the back of his tractor that hills up the land. And you can see what those hills look like from that. It's a machine specially made for processing the soil in that way. And as photo number 3 shows, this is quite often done on farms where flowers are planted, where sunflowers are planted for the birdseed industry, where things like lavender and other flowering plants that have high aroma are grown for the perfume and soap making and so on, and they tend to use ridge till. Now, an important disclaimer, this right here is not my idea of farming. Please don't think for a moment that it is. I don't have my girlfriend outside the trailer planting cabbage while I drink Bud. So now let's switch gears and take a look at Lake Erie area farming effects. This is something pretty serious that's been going on for a long time, and it affects a lot of people. Lake Erie farming effects is one thing, an annual summer Western Basin algae bloom that is very, very large. It is caused by several things. Number 1, conventional plowing that is done on farm fields in the lake area, mainly around the area of Maumee Bay. And the phosphorus and nitrogen runoff as a result of that, which we will talk about a little more. Number 2, intensive animal farming, which I will define for you. And number 3, summer lake temperatures that for long periods of time exceed 60 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the scoop on intensive animal farming. There are currently 175 operations near the Maumee Bay. And each of those has dozens and dozens of livestock buildings. Each one houses up to 1,000 dairy cows or hogs, chickens per building. And now they produce 5.5 million tons of animal manure each year. What's done with it? It's used as fertilizer on the crop fields in the area, which there are over 1,000 acres farmed. And part of the problem, most of it's irrigated from the lake or from the Maumee River or Maumee Bay. This is what that looks like. You have these fields, crop fields, close to Lake Erie. This brown band here represents the layer of manure that's spread for those crops to be planted in. And the white band is the irrigation ditches coming from the lake or the bays to the fields. And then you have two green arrows. These are, in the case of the small arrow, phosphorus and nitrogen runoff, which comes from the manure that is traveling along the surface, along the ground, and running off into Lake Erie. The large green arrow is that same nitrogen and phosphorus leaching down into the ground, into our limestone bedrock, and back up into the lake. Now, with Lake Erie Basin CAFO, which stands for Concentrated Animal Feeding Operations, which, keep in mind, this is not typical farming. Each of those animals is kept in a stall so small that they cannot move around. They have feeding and watering trays in front of them. The feeding trays come through on belts. You have workers walk up and down the lines, injecting them with hormones and steroids and so on. This started out smaller and has just mushroomed. In 2005, there were 9 million animals involved in this. By 2018, it had sharply increased to 20.4 million animals. And by 2019, 25 million animals. And the numbers haven't been published yet for 2021, or excuse me, 2020, and it'll be quite a while before we see numbers for 2021, probably a year. So what happens is the phosphorus and nitrogen from that manure that is used to fertilize the fields creates microcystin toxins. These are bacterial-based toxins. So in other words, these are toxins that come from bacteria in the manure from the livestock animals' bodies. And it is good for crops. It's great for crop growth, but is poison to aquatic ecosystems and to human consumption sources. The microcystin toxins, as we mentioned, flush and leach into the lake and the Maumee area water table. They create in the bay and the lake large oxygen depleted dead zones, which kills off any aquatic life in the area. And this has been a summer event for the past 20 years. Water for much of the Western Basin and the Maumee Bay area is unsafe for drinking. It's unsafe for bathing and cooking. Toledo is always the most hardest hit by this. They always end up with boil your water warnings before using. And again, nothing can live in it. There are fish kill-offs of critical plankton, macroinvertebrates. It's very harmful to birds that take fish from those areas, cormorants, eagles, cranes, herons, egrets. So now this photo on the left, this is from outer space. If you notice this whitish area, what looks whitish anyway, that's the Western Basin. That's an annual algae bloom. That's what it looks like. Now, what happens after heavy rains in the summer? Because we're talking about the summer, the water's gotten choppy from the rains and from heavy winds with the storms. And as you can see, it's a light green in this photo. It's all over the whole lake. It's everywhere. And it's even gotten up into Lake St. Mary's, which connects to Lake Huron. So now we're threatening another Great Lake as well. And this is important because 70% of all fresh water in the country is contained in the Great Lakes. So that's kind of staggering. So now the takeaway, at least for me, and in my opinion, for what it's worth, all human actions and practices affect nature and our ecosystems. So, you know, when we live close or even somewhat close to waterways, rivers, streams, lakes, like you see in these photos in the top, these fancy houses, even in our own suburbs, you've got all of that rainwater, etc., that empties up in storm sewer culverts, that empties into our bodies of water, empties into the Scioto River, the Olentangy River, Alum Creek Lake, Hoover Reservoir, Buckeye Lake, about any body of water you can think of in Ohio. And, you know, it's soil runoff, which silt from soil runoff is actually the #1 pollutant of water in our state. But it's also runoff from lawn chemicals and oils and road salt from our roads. And it affects all the animals and the insects. A lot of the insects, which are in great decline right now, and they are at the bottom of the food chain for our birds, which are in great decline. And I threw in the middle of here a picture of the monarch butterfly, because the monarch butterfly right now is supposed to be on the national, the federally endangered list. It just is not technically yet, because the federal government, Department of the Interior, has a backlog of cases to complete to put other species on the endangered list. Seems kind of odd, but that's the case. So if you think about it, if you use any of these products or services on your lawns and your gardens, you might as well be telling our friend here, Chippy the Chipmunk, we're sending you to the electric chair. And Chippy says no. So that's my little speech. If you have any questions or comments on this program, please message us on our Facebook page, and we will gladly answer them for you. Thank you very much for watching and listening, and we will see you next time.